Rec-
Hello, History 17A. Welcome. Get your names down. So you notice, right, today's assignment is different from the norm. Normally, I do things in argumentative fashion, which I definitely prefer. But for multiple reasons, I've yet to go to that format on this one subject. So we're doing the War of 1812, and it's in very traditional fashion, in which I just simply ask you to watch the video and answer the questions. A lot of the questions are not open-ended, so there's not a lot of room for personal thought. And like I said, I'm not proud of that component to the assignment, and hence it's only one assignment in which we do this. But again, we will. The answers are kind of cut and dry and found within the video. And please remember also, is very shortly I'm going to put up a quiz on chapter 7 in Alan Brinkley's textbook and ask you to complete that by Sunday night as well. All right. And so don't forget about that. I'll probably accompany that with a reminding announcement. All right, great. I have the names. So looking at this, right, like I said, not very open-ended questions. We're looking at just this list. There's the exact URL for the video. All right. How did the U.S. fight, or who did the U.S. fight in the War of 1812? How is Canada connected to the story? What reason or two was given for poor American military prowess? How does William Henry Harrison play the villain in the narrative? What were the two official reasons for which the U.S. declared war? How is Tecumseh portrayed in the video? An example or two, please. How did Detroit earn a negative story in the history book? What is the story of the Star Spangled Banner? What is the story of Oliver Hazard Perry? How is the Battle of New Orleans depicted, etc. All right. So, like I said, very elementary. Just want you to discern the basics, and then I want to give today just kind of a basic overview of the war. So, as you recall, right, we separated from Great Britain. Great Britain was formed in about 1707 from England and Scotland, right, in Northern Ireland, and we were under Great Britain, and we fought from 1775 to 1783 and gained our independence. And we formed the 13 colonies. Then we had a confederacy up until 1787. And then in that summer, the founding fathers got together, devised the Constitution for a federal constitutional republic. And the ratification process was a little messy and difficult, but enough states, 9 states passed it, ratified it, and here we are, right? So then by the time of 1812, we're fighting England again, right? And we're fighting them not only here in the States, but we're fighting them in Spanish Florida and in British Canada, okay? And not to mention out on the high seas, in multiple seas. So at any rate, right, what you look for is the general themes of the overweening themes of this topic is, for one, um, people look at it and they try to they're a little bit hard pressed more than in other wars to try to derive significance from it, because ultimately, right, in Belgium, our 5 diplomats and their 3, grudgingly, after a lot of haggling, just came to the conclusion that they were going to maintain the status quo from before the war, status quo antebellum. And so hence, right, nothing changed as far as territory. Our territory remained intact, although I would make the argument that that's not exactly true, because of the Native Americans, in particular in Spanish Florida, which we're going to grab a hold of. And so, and then not to mention impressment, right? Technically, one of the 2 reasons for which we went to war was because England was violating our international rights as a neutral country. Not until the Crimean War, about 50 years later, are you going to have, more codified version of international law. But I think you could definitely make the argument, morphing from the Catholic Church and its doctrine on just war, and multiple uh, conferences that had taken place throughout medieval and early modern Europe, they had already derived a notion that the major powers of Europe, especially, would agree upon certain rules and limitations on the conduct of war, and those had included, right, the right of neutral countries to trade with nations at war, technically called belligerents. And so, remember, the French Revolution is going to get a little radical after the Jacobins take over from the Gironde, and then it's going to turn into an international war when there were attempts to rescue Louis XVI from beyond the borders of France. And Napoleon will eventually take over the French army through his Napoleonic Code. He will try to forcefully spread the French Revolution throughout Europe. And of course, those who were for the Ancien regime, life before the French Revolution, were trying to thwart him from doing such, right? So the Holy Alliance, right, of Austria, Prussia, England, they're going to fight against Napoleon and ultimately defeat him, right? As the story goes, not to oversimplify it, but for one, he tried to invade Russia, and that was in some ways his own undoing. But at any rate, they're fighting that war throughout this same time period. Okay, and so as they're fighting that, we're fighting to try to end their violation of our neutral rights. And they had something called the Orders of Council, whereby anyone trying to trade with Napoleonic France anywhere within the area in which they had conquered and claimed had to first go to England as a private merchant and be taxed by the English. And of course, the American merchants were not okay with doing that. They weren't, prior to and a part of the narrative of us fighting for independence from England against her mercantilist restrictions. And but don't get me wrong, Napoleonic France did the same thing. They had the Berlin Decrees and others in which Napoleon claimed very similar things, where both sides were depriving us as a neutral nation of our private merchants' right as neutrals to trade non-contraband to one or either sides and throughout Europe, because you're talking about food and clothing, etc., not guns. And that never ended. The British would not even promise that they would. They ended the Orders of Council, so to an extent it did, but impressment, looking for runaway English sailors on American ships, stopping them without, kind of like just a general warrant, a general writ, and coming upon board forcefully if possible, if need be, to check for English runaways. That was integral in our declaration of war, and England would not even agree to stop that even at the end of the war. There was nothing about impressment. So you think, all right, well, man, if not much territorial change happened, and if the key issue of impressment wasn't resolved, then what the heck came out of this War of 1812? Well, for one, like I said, an exception to this status quo of before the war, we gained territory at the expense of the proverbial red sticks. The red sticks were the native tribes and those within the native tribes who chose to fight with England against us, right? And so you have the key areas of the Ohio Valley and there by the Great Lakes, as well as down in the south, you see here in the Mississippi Territory, present day Mississippi and Alabama, as well as Spanish Florida. Uh, so at any rate, so we did gain land there, and that is going to be, laden with different themes and different directions that we could go if we wanted to. For one, right, people oftentimes tie it to the Civil War. Because, for instance, the Democratic Republicans, right, who later just dropped that name to truncate it to Democrats, they are going to develop a 19th century political habit of offering votes to poor, white, ambitious American men in return for offering cheap or available lands on the frontier in the West. But of course, that's at the expense of Native Americans. And so that's a big theme that people tie into, and a precedent that had begun, prior to even this war, but it really stepped up as a precedent to follow later of dispossessing the Native Americans of their land. You also have the unification effect that the War of 1812 had on us, supposedly culturally, and in other ways politically as well. So culturally, right, this coincides at a time when, for instance, I think it was Daniel or Noah Webster, when he writes Webster's dictionary. And, for instance, honor is morphed by the Americans from HONOUR to just taking the U out and OR, right? We literally declared cultural independence from England, because by and large, when you do your colonial history, right, demographically with numbers of people, you look at the type of government and family culture, religion, etc., you could make the argument that America was largely England transplanted here to North America, right? That we're largely kind of an English or WASP country in origins at this time. And so now we're declaring our independence, that no, we are Americans, right? We quote, speak American. We our institutions, and of course, in our own site, right? We are much more egalitarian. We put everyone on more equal footing. The whole Enlightenment and all of that, right? That we're proud of being better, more down to earth, a country for the common person, the virtuous common person that Thomas Jefferson kind of eulogized about his own father and in some of his writings. And so that was a big step in the War of 1812. We had these folk heroes, right? And the folk heroes were all the more venerated because they were not in any way connected to Mother England's ruling hierarchy. So Andrew Jackson, right, and these others in Kentucky, these volunteers from Tennessee, etc., who are going to represent a more grassroots American image that is divorced from England. We're going to get into that more when we cover Andrew Jackson's time period. But a lot of them, for instance, were Scots-Irish in origin, and they had they had a history and tradition of resentment and defiance toward Mother England, and also of poverty, and of men like Calhoun, Clay, and Jackson, as becoming self-made men in this new country where this country belongs to the common man and his opportunities to rise. And so that came out of the war as well. Politically, one of our two parties died virtually at the end of the war, the Federalist Party, right? The conservative party of John Adams and Hamilton. And by the way, if you remember the John Adams handout, he is going to alienate himself from both parties and eventually leave the Federalist Party. But with the Federalists, right, the conservatives who wanted a stronger central government, who were kind of elitist against democracy, they and intended to represent the bourgeoisie of the northern colonies, right, the people of the city, and those tied to the merchant class and the bourgeois class of business owners, the non-farmers, basically. They are going to die out by the end of this war. And so we're going to become, for a brief period of U.S. history, virtually a one-party country, at least institutionally, within the elections of federal offices. And it's just going to be the Democratic Republicans. But an irony here is, right, is by the end of the war, the Democratic Republicans, this next generation after Hamilton, like Henry Clay and others, right, they are going to, although Clay will join the later Whig Party, but at any rate, this next generation, they're going to embrace at least parts of Hamilton's vision for the country. And they're not going to say that they had an ideological change or that they were just a different generation that chose to go the old Federalist route. But what they're going to contend basically is that some of Hamilton's vision was necessary for our self-sufficiency, for us to become independent, especially economically. So they like the idea of Hamilton's that we should introduce lots of different types of industries, right? So that we can grow and produce all our own stuff and we don't become reliant upon another country for its goods. No economic dependence, right? Because to Jefferson and the others, they believe that if you economically depend upon someone, eventually in one way or another, you're going to politically depend upon them as well. And so in the name of patriotism and becoming self-sufficient as a country, the Democratic Republicans who once hated Hamilton and his system are going to ironically embrace it by the end of the war. And this is going to help, to some people, arguably, help create the American giant that arises in the 1800s, as far as industry goes, as far as infrastructure with roads, canals, railroads later on, et cetera, right? Connecting one region to the next, getting commerce, trade going, right, and industry booming. And so, because largely you could find a lot of evidence for the success of the English blockade of our East Coast and other areas where they somewhat economically strangled us, and the war became at times by 1814 very economically harmful to our country. Our The value of our imports and exports went down to about a quarter of what they had once existed prior to this war. So England really put the hurt to us economically just with her naval blockades alone. And so we claim to have learned our lesson from that and wanted to become more economically self sufficient at the end of the War of 1812. So those are some of the themes that I've come across as far as trying to derive significance of this brief war that was seen as kind of a backwater little struggle in comparison to the Napoleonic Wars that were getting all the world's attention at the same time. As far as the fighting goes, a lot of the same themes you could find in any war are found also in the War of 1812. For instance, contingency, the what ifs, right? What if this certain general had not done that or had only done this? Things could have gone differently. As in most wars, that happens here. What comes to mind immediately is Prevost. Prevost and his attack on Plattsburgh and his way down to New York from Canada. He at any given time had at least a 3-to-1 advantage of troops over our troops. And around Plattsburgh, after a little bit of resistance, he inexplicably retreated. And we can never know what may have happened had he succeeded in what Burgoyne had tried to do during the War for Independence, cut off the New England states and take over New York. And so that didn't happen as far as the what ifs, right? As far as let's see here, the significance of certain areas. Let's see here, or significance as far as American morale, American patriotism, and enthusiasm for the war. We had some war heroes, right, at that time that served to kind of galvanize the country and its self identity, etc. Even when some of their battles and exploits, when you look at the whole war, were not that pivotal and actually, in avoiding a loss to England. So, for instance, you have Isaac Hull of the USS Constitution. He fought the Guerriere. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but that's when the cannons were shooting off the sides of his ship, and a gentleman said that this our ship seems to be made of iron, so it was called Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution. It became famous for that. James Lawrence went down with his ship, the Chesapeake, and he lost in a battle with the HMS Shannon. And when he was dying, he said, don't give up the ship, right? Fight to your dying breath. And that was hugely pivotal in the press for American morale. Oliver Hazard Perry at Lake Erie. He had an incident in which his USS Lawrence was going down, and he paddle boated to a nearby American ship called the Niagara, and supposedly stood up on the boat and taunted the British as they fired at him, and made it to the Niagara and ended up turning the tide of the battle and won that battle. He became a huge hero as well. And and then, of course, who could forget Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans? And the irony there, right, is that by the end, in the middle of the winter, the end of 1814, the war had officially been declared over in Belgium, and the terms had already been set. And here they are fighting in January of 1815, a month later, not even aware that the war had officially ended. And so a guy named Packenham came and gave his life and died with the casualties supposedly were up to like 2/3 of the British invasion force. They just walked right into disaster as this ragtag group of Americans, including biracial and free African Americans, and also allied Native Americans, many of them Cherokee, etc., throughout the war, fought alongside. So it was a very motley group of Americans who fought off that attack, and it was a great source of patriotic fervor. All right. Um, as far as low points for us, right? Detroit was surrendered to the British here on American soil. Of course, most dramatically, Washington, D.C. was burnt to the ground in retaliation for us burning York, or modern day Toronto, to the ground by Ross and Cockburn and other British leaders. And Madison and President Madison and Dolly and others had to get out just moments before it all went down. And then, of course, we had a brief turnaround in morale at the attack, the naval attack at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and that's where the lawyer Francis Scott Key was aboard the Minden, and he was watching the attack on that fort by the British as he was trying to get a gentleman out of custody of the British and negotiate his freedom. Okay, and so at any rate, yeah, so you have a lot of the same common themes. Also of note, right, is we tried to invade Canada, and of course, the two common interpretations for that, as far as why our government and our military establishment wanted to invade Canada. One is going to be pretty much akin to 1840s coming up, the notion of manifest destiny, although not yet termed such. The idea, right, that we're an exceptional country of exceptional opportunities and freedoms, and that people ought to be grateful for the American flag to fly over their land. So, yes, even be grateful to be conquered by us and our military, right? Because we supposedly are granting them a higher standard of living and a better government and economy to live under. And so there was part of that in the whole Canadian rush. And then also, right, there was the idea of using Canada to, quote, win the peace. That if we could win certain areas in Canada and come to the peace table with England, that it would make her more vulnerable, right, and more humbled at the diplomatic table, and inclined to surrender and give more concessions to us, particularly, right, to end impressment, to promise to end impressment of our young men on the seas, which of course did not happen. You'll see in the video the three invasions of Quebec were pretty pitiful. All right. You have the issues with the military and federalism, right? The notion that the founding fathers, that we're supposed to have a balance between state powers and the central federal government's power, right? And they have some concurrent powers that they share, some enumerated powers that were specifically given to the federal government, and then reserved powers by the 10th Amendment that are reserved to the states. And so that issue came up quite often during the war. For one, was that there was a quasi and almost draft, whereby President James Madison is going to try to require of the state governors and legislators a certain number of militiamen to fight under, with, and under the regular army, because the regular army was at 6,000 men at the beginning of the war. It was pitiful. And so there were those who contended, right, that the federal government should not have that power, that it should simply make a requisition or politely ask the states for a certain number of men, and the states were to carry that out as their own prerogative, and jealously holding on to that freedom. And so that was an issue with federalism, right? And then also the acceptance of new states in the West. Some of those, especially in the New England colonies in New York and Pennsylvania, supposedly betrayed somewhat of a selfish fear and anxiety that they were going to lose their influence as a faction in the country. Remember, a faction, according to Madison, is a group that shares the same self-interest and or the same beliefs. So the bourgeois people, right, they wanted to make allies in Congress out of these new Western states. But they found that demographically, a lot of poor white men were moving out west into the frontier. And a lot of them were choosing professions that revolved around farming, commercial farming. And so hence, they perceived that these new Western states were likely going to vote the same way as the Southern representatives did, because they seemed to be demographically tied together. They're the same backgrounds, the same economic class, and involved in the same agricultural industries, right? So there was that contention to such an extent that many of the Federalists in the Northeast greatly opposed this war. They called it Mr. Madison's War, right? And his Democratic Republican Party's war against their will. In the Senate, the vote was 19-13. It was a close vote. It was a controversial war, at least at the beginning. And so the Federalist Party, right, What's not going to help them is the Hartford Convention in Connecticut. A group of about 26 men met secretly. One of them, Timothy um, Bigelow, was known as a secessionist who believed that the states have a right to opt to get out of the Union and leave it, should their state legislator choose. And that frightened a lot of Americans, especially in the height of the national capital getting burnt down, right? That Americans felt there was a need for unity and stay united and strong as a country. And so it was seen as being somewhat treasonous, this Hartford Convention, and it did a lot of harm in the public's mind to the Federalist Party and its reputation as a conservative anti-war party. And so you have all those elements and more. Taxation of the states, because of course the government was going broke during this war. And so, like I said, a lot tied to federalism, states versus federal powers. Not to mention the whole idea, which we're going to see much more of in the near future, nullification, right? The Constitution, the original Constitution, is not clear. Um, it says that the laws made by Congress must abide by the Constitution, but it doesn't say which body of people, which federal institution or figure has the right to determine if those laws are constitutional or not. And as you are aware, if you're reading the textbook, the Supreme Court is ultimately going to grab that power for itself, right? In the Marbury versus Madison case, by declaring for the first time a congressional law as unconstitutional and therefore nullified, therefore of not to be carried out, not to be recognized legally. And so the states, and this goes back to the Kentucky resolutions, et cetera, Virginia resolutions, where the state legislators are going to make that same contention that they, as state governments, have the right to say no to a federal law if they deem it to be unconstitutional. And of course, just the way things work now, those of you who are not well versed in U.S. history could easily guess that interpretation did not win out as far as the states having a right to nullify a federal law. But all of that came up onto the surface amidst all the drama of the War of 1812. All right. And so let's see here. What else do I want to mention? And then open it up to questions. So recall from the video that the Native American tribes and those within certain Native American tribes who chose to fight with the English were called at that time red sticks for the red ochre that they painted onto their tomahawks, etc. And so needless to say, we're going to be vindictive toward them by the end of the war. As far as Native American, stereotypes of us and our stereotypes of them, those were exacerbated, right, during the War of 1812, namely on account of what you can guess, massacres. Because by the very name, right, there's something that seems to be in violation of law, whether it be domestic law, human or international law, etc., right? And one of those, main components to that notion of natural law is leaving non-combatants alone. If someone is not wearing a uniform, if someone is not armed, if someone is a mother raising her children, an elderly man at his home, they are to be left alone, right? But that was not the case in some of these instances. So you could look up things like the Duck Creek Massacre. You could look at the massacre of Fort Mims. And there are multiple others whereby there were atrocities both sides, both ways. A definitive defeat for the Native American Red Sticks was at Horseshoe Bend by Andrew Jackson's volunteers, his militia, and their Cherokee and other Native American allies. And so, are there any questions or comments?
You mentioned the video. I came on a little bit late. Is that something that's recorded?
It is. Well, what it is, Karen, is that it is the exact. Sorry, I'm a terrible multitasker. I'm writing your name down. The exact URL for it is found on your assignment in Canvas.
Okay.
So just hit on that link, okay?
All right,
and
thank you.
it'll give you the exact video that you're looking for.
Okay. Are there any tests this week or quizzes or?
Yes, there is a quiz. Yeah, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, you're going to have a quiz on chapter 7. Okay.
Okay,
And also note what I had forgotten to do, and I greatly apologize, is I had forgotten to post quiz number 3.
yeah,
So I might give you literally the duration of the semester to do number 3 on your own time whenever you want to do it, on account of my mistake. But here on out, like with quiz 4, I have a definitive date for you, and that's this Sunday night as usual, 1 week.
okay.
So yeah, look for that very soon. I just posted it for my other school, and I'm about to post yours after class.
And that was
So
chapter 6,
yeah,
right?
chapter 7. Yeah, chapter
Oh, I
7.
mean, test 3?
It's quiz 4.
Okay.
Because I had failed to give you quiz 3.
Oh,
So
I see.
quiz 3 will subsequently be put on, and I'll make it clear online that you have a long time to do that one. But quiz 4 on chapter 7, I need you to do by Sunday night, in
Okay,
addition to this assignment, this video assignment on the War of 1812.
thank you.
No, the oh the okay, guys. All right, let's see here. I have just made another mistake, and I apologize. All right, here's the issue. You guys have had a spring break. My other school did not. You guys were right on par with the other school. So week 2 at this other school was week 2 for you. Week 4, etc., etc. It has now changed this week because you guys had a week off. So you're 1 week behind my other school. My other school is doing the War of 1812. You guys have great man history of the early republic this week, not the War of 1812. I am so sorry. All right. So what I think I'm going to do is I think that I'm going to have both of them do not this Sunday, the 21st, but the following Sunday, the 28th. Give you 2 weeks to do both of these, so that you don't feel rushed for this Sunday night to do the early republic alone. Okay. Um, I'm so sorry, you guys. I just completely forgot about your spring break. So what we just did right now, you guys, was supposed to be next week's assignment on the War of 1812. I am so sorry. All right. And so what I want to do is I want to briefly go over the basics of the early republic. Again, you guys, I cannot believe I just did that. No, thank you. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it tremendously. So let me go to this. Let me find the early republic one. Goodness gracious. All right. So yeah, you guys are going to have 2 weeks to do both of these. So like I said, what we have just covered is technically next week's assignment on the War of 1812. All right. It's during the presidency of our 4th president, James Madison, from 1812 to 1815. But prior to that, we have skipped the first, obviously, the first 3 presidents. So with number 1, all right, what I want you to note is that initially, nowhere in the Constitution does it state that we were to have a 2-party system. Okay. But with the 2-party system, it's going to kind of organically develop largely out of opposition to Washington's administration. Okay. Washington's administration is going to, by the end of his second term, seem in the image of some liberals to become excessively conservative, too conservative, unbearably conservative, so that they will supposedly feel a need to develop a rival liberal political party known as the Democratic Republicans. Okay. So why did it seem too conservative? That narrative is almost always inextricably linked to the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton and his public image, etc., went almost in some ways you could say. I've read some biographies of him that stated that he almost had a perverse desire of making political enemies and appearing to be more conservative than he really was. So he had no problem with making enemies and ruffling feathers. And when he became the Secretary of the Treasury, look at his economic system, if you will, and look to the fact that a lot of that which he did, you cannot find in the Constitution. Now, remember, the liberals at that time period were libertarian. They were fearful and hateful toward big, strong central government. They wanted it to be small, decentralized, as limited as possible, and unobtrusive into our lives. So, therefore, the liberals at that time period wanted a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, right? If the Constitution did not state that the president could do something, that his cabinet could do something, that Congress could do something, then it was very clear to them they couldn't do it. The Federalists took a more pragmatic, as the Conservative Party took a more big government, pragmatic, practical stance, and said, well, if it is implied that within the language of the Constitution, if it's kind of suggested or implied indirectly, then they ought to be able to do it. And they even said that even if it's not implied anywhere, that there are certain inherent powers, certain powers that are just they must innately, in and of themselves, come with that position as president, for instance, right? So they were for stretching the federal government's power for what they thought were practical reasons. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. And so Alexander Hamilton creates a national bank. Well, look in the Constitution, you're not going to find that. Okay. A national bank. In addition to that, he is going to levy, as the Secretary of Treasury, certain taxes that may or may not have been passed by Congress. Well, how ironic, right? Taxation without representation. Only elected reps were to okay certain taxes. And ironically, one of those taxes, he called them sin or luxury taxes, in addition to alcohol, was on tea. And right, the irony of that with British and the Boston Tea Party and all that, right? Um, Also, he contended that there was a great need of the federal government to take over the state's debts and think like a good libertarian, right? On the shorthand, right? If you're, a government that is largely in debt, a state that's largely in debt, like one of the Carolinas, and the government's offering to pay it for you, you would think at face value that that would be wonderful, right? But instead, the libertarians thought that what the big government does now for good, it can do for your harm in the future, right? And so giving the government that power over the state's finances to them was scary. And there was nothing in the Constitution that stated that it could. But Hamilton insisted on it nonetheless, right? Not to mention, he's not an elected guy, he's handpicked on the cabinet. Does someone have a question? All right. And then, so also, there was a need for subsidies for the government to help out certain industries, right? That he thought were vital to the country's well-being. So first of all, right, he wanted this country to become commercialized, people trading from one region to the next, industrialized, right, with new factories and new industries manufacturing goods. He wanted to become urbanized with big cities, etc. This was anathema. This was just awful to the Southern Jeffersonian liberals, right? And so he wanted to help out certain industries because we thought was what was good for them would be ultimately good for the entire country. And so by giving subsidies, right, it exists to this day. You can give them tax breaks. You can give them outright money. You can give them bond certificates that stated right on paper as if they had lent money to the government and they were to get it back with interest. There are multiple ways that you can you could subsidize as a government and help out certain industries. But what did it look like, you guys? It looked like he was favoring the northern bourgeois people, right? The business owners and those that were primarily of the north, the northern states. He put import tariffs, right, for manufactured goods that could be bought at better quality and cheaper price from Belgium and from England. Um, he put taxes on them to artificially inflate their prices so people would buy American. In the long run, right, it's seen as kind of training wheels for the American industry so they can get on their own feet eventually and compete with these bigger guys overseas. But in the short run, it's forcing American consumers to buy shoddily made, expensive American products instead. So there was resentment there. But also his bonds. He wanted to borrow money, as much money as possible, on behalf of the federal government from private lenders, right? And slowly take his time in paying them back. And of course, what type of class of people are able and willing to lend decent amounts of money to the government? Those who are already pretty darn well off, right? The upper middle class, bourgeois, wealthy, urban people. And so it seems like he's forming a plutocracy, a rule by the rich, and collaborating with big business to subsidize them and borrowing from the wealthy bond purchasers, right? And taking his time and paying them back. So all of these things, right, are causing alarm amongst the Democratic Republicans, the libertarians. And then to make matters worse is his bank is challenged. It goes to the Supreme Court. And what do they cite? They cite the necessary and proper clause, right? And the necessary and proper clause was seen as dangerous to the libertarians because at the end of that enumerated list in Article 1, Section 8, saying specifically what Congress can do, it says, oh, by the way, Congress can also do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out any of the things on this list. So you like the fact that it is a specifically stated list that is finite. So hence, if it's not on the list, they can't do it if you're a libertarian. Now, this necessary and proper clause is like a way of stretching it all, stretching the federal government's power to do things that are clearly not on the list under the name of that necessary and proper clause. And what do you know? Supreme Court cites that clause in allowing Hamilton's bank and system to exist. So this is all frightening the libertarian liberals, right? And then look up the Whiskey Rebellion in your textbook and also on number 1 and see how the federal government is going to turn its own military against a group of farmers who refuse to pay a tax on their whiskey. All right. And so this is all going to be seen as alarming to the liberals and hence provoke them to form an oppositional party. Any questions there? All right, with number 2, this is great man history on our second president, John Adams. John Adams became president in 1796, and he was our first one-term president. He's going to lose re-election to Jefferson in 1800. How is that? Well, I would argue that this book by McCullough is somewhat court history. It somewhat praises and defends John Adams as a person and as a president, saying that this guy was just too darn honest. He was a man of integrity and had his own mind. And because he was so independent minded and had such integrity in his decisions, he was not willing to play the political game that was necessary for his political survival. So hence he was too honest and too filled with integrity and independence of mind for his own good. And he suffered for that virtue by alienating himself from both parties. All right. So he started off as a Federalist. He has some very arrogant, kind of like Hamilton, conservative quotes saying that he didn't trust the masses of people, especially those that were uneducated. So, you know, he definitely, and then also when the French Revolution went into full swing by the time he became president. Remember, by 1796, they had already beheaded Louis XVI. They had already declared a virtual war against the Ancien regime, those before the Enlightenment, those before the French Revolution. So the French nobility were being having their stuff, their lands confiscated, their titles stripped, and in some cases, eventually even sent to the guillotine to be publicly executed, simply for their identification with that class, not for having committed a single crime. Like I said, the French Revolution got pretty radical. Not only that, they went after the Catholic hierarchy and church and even the Christian faith in the French Revolution, being strongly either agnostic or atheistic, anti religion. All right. So, for those reasons, John Adams was identified himself very vocally as a Christian. And so he had thought that the French Revolution went way too far over the line in declaring class war against the rich, confiscating and redistributing land, um, their mock trials and mass executions, and their attack upon the Christian faith and the Catholic Church. He made it very clear he was not in sympathy with the direction that they had gone too far. So when he becomes president, there is created, and it's spoken pretty well, stated pretty well in our textbook, is that the French Revolution had a very polarizing effect on our population. It seemed like people either really continued to steadfastly promote the French Revolution, even as it became more radical, as kind of a continuation of what we had begun in our quote revolution, and adhering to the French Enlightenment in particular. And those Americans like John Adams who thought it was ghastly, too radical, too bloody, etc. And so it's going to have a very polarizing effect on Americans around 1800. So, as you might guess, the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, the liberals, uh, were in sympathy with the idea of either staying out of the Continental Wars or siding with France in the French Revolution. The Federalists were for either staying out or fighting with the English and the Austrians and Prussians against the French. Because remember, because Louis the 16th was captured for a while before he was beheaded. There he had literally relations because of endogamy, marrying within the family of other crowns throughout Europe. The Habsburg family of Austria and other old school governments tried to rescue him across the French border on more than one occasion. Then when they gave warnings, stern warnings to the Jacobin leadership not to have him executed. They did anyway. And so this became an international war in which Austria, Prussia, England, they tried to keep to stem the tide of this revolution and put someone in Louis's family back on the throne. And then likewise, when a bit of chaos had ensued in the French leadership, Napoleon will rise, right? And he will institute the Napoleonic Code, whereby he tries to, by force of gun, impose the French Revolution onto the rest of Europe. Because just to show the complexity of this, you look at the Napoleonic Code, and it actually was rather enlightened as far as natural rights, especially for women and other marginalized groups. But again, right, they were under the tyrannical rule of one man, ironically, and which was definitely not in line with the Enlightenment. And they were trying to do it by force of arms through the military. So this became known as the Napoleonic or Continental Wars. And so, what is John Adams to do? He's between the two parties, right? Well, the idea is he alienates both, because for one, he can't hide his animosity toward the French Revolution, and he very much shows disgust with violations of our international rights on the high seas. And we mentioned that already, right? Backwards fashion, chronologically, with the War of 1812, is through the Berlin Decree made by Napoleon and the Orders of Council made by the English government. They're going to violate all neutral parties' rights to freely trade with either side and insist that you cannot trade with their enemy, even non-contraband, even non-military stuff. And so that's going to lead to some violations of our rights on the seas, right? So what John Adams does is he raises the Navy and he sends them on a convoy system to protect our merchants. But he does it largely around the French Caribbean. So he's making it very clear he's more worried about French violations of our international rights than he is of English violations. thus showing his true colors, right? That he was against the French Revolution, and if anybody, if he had to pick a side, he would have chosen the English side. Uh, this was known as the quasi or almost war because it was never declared. So you can imagine how much more that infuriated the Democratic Republicans, right? The libertarian liberals, is they were thinking, my goodness, this guy has not followed the Constitution. First, Congress has to raise an army and declare war. Then he could send troops to their death wherever. And he's doing it first without congressional approval. And then, not to mention, he's fighting against the French fleet and not the English to show his true colors as he's against this French Revolution. And note also, with the exception of England, possibly, the powers that fought against Napoleon were very old school pre-Enlightenment powers, right? They had emperors still and kings and queens. Their governments were not very representative. They didn't have written constitutions declaring natural rights of their citizens. So they were seen to be very archaic, very old school, right? So hence, because he sided with them, the liberals ran with that in the press and say, see, our our president wants to become king. He's a monarchist, and he wants to take us backward in our form of government and his sympathy toward these backward powers against Napoleon. And so, in addition to that, the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? The Alien and Sedition Acts are instituted, and the Alien Act gave him power to deport foreign French radicals. And he Congress, the Constitution states that naturalization of immigrants and policies thereof are in the powers of Congress, not the president. So it looked like Congress was giving him this power, handing it over to him, which of course the liberals did not like and frightened them because the checks and balances were meant to be there for a reason, right? To prevent tyranny by the founding fathers. And then also the Sedition Acts. If you wrote despairingly of the government and could not, it could be found guilty of libel, writing something false of the government, and you had no reason to believe it was true, but every reason to believe and know that it was false, and did so anyway, that you could be arrested and fined. And of course, that's no longer the case. Um, and so it was very much an infringement on Americans' First Amendment rights, the Sedition Act. And what do you know? What also looked bad is his administration began going after some of the most liberal press writers. The Aurora was very liberal as a newspaper. The National Gazette, under a guy named Philip Freneau, these attacked Hamilton and George Washington's administration before. Now they were heavily attacking John Adams' administration in their newspapers. He went after them to get them arrested. Okay. And so it just looked like he was becoming a tyrant. So he sees doing one thing after another to alienate himself from the liberals, right? This one term president. However, he repeatedly, I think on at least 3 occasions, he changed um, and renewed the diplomats that were sent to France when they didn't seem to be able to come successfully to terms with the French government. And so he went out of his way to try to keep the peace and try to establish some type of agreement with the French over our rights on the seas, right? And so to the conservatives, this was maddening because they're like, okay, you're teasing us. You're starting this quasi war in the Caribbean against the French Navy, which we agree with, but you won't ask Congress to declare war. And you're going out of your way to continually just engage in diplomacy to get them to come to peaceful terms. So that alienated the right, the conservatives of his own party. He also scarcely invoked and carried out the Alien Act or the Espionage or the Sedition Act. And so, because he showed evidence in his writings with his wife, Abigail, and others, that he had moral qualms about the constitutionality and the morality of those laws. Because remember, he himself didn't make those laws, although he approved of them. They were made by his Federalist Congress. And so, to alienate the conservatives, he didn't really carry these acts out. And then also, Haiti had their slave revolution under Toussaint Louverture. I probably butchered that name, but at any rate, it became known as a Black Republic of ex-slaves. And he asked Congress to recognize them. And he was an abolitionist against slavery, he and his son. And so that obviously alienated himself from some of the conservatives. He also was too honest for his own good in his personal life. Oftentimes, the negative characteristic ascribed to him in the primary sources of those who rubbed elbows with him at that time said that he was very irritable. He was very easily angered and didn't tolerate the idiosyncrasies of other people very well. He made it known he could not stand as a person Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton was a very powerful enemy to make in his own party as a fellow conservative. And so his tiff, if you will, continual tiff with Hamilton did not help his political success at all. So hence, right, the notion that John Adams almost ironically ought to be praised, according to McCullough, for being a one-term president because he was just too honest for his own good. And a lot of that derived, he thought, that type of integrity and independence of mind derived from his religious beliefs, that he was to be held accountable by God after his death, and he wanted to make the right decisions, not the politically popular decisions from instance to instance. All right, any questions? So then our third president, right, is Thomas Jefferson. Okay, there are a few presidents where people oftentimes use terms like enigma, right? Like this dude is a paradox. He's riddled with contradictions. He's a puzzle that can't be solved. And Jefferson is definitely one of the few for which historians often make that claim. I would argue that McKinley and Woodrow Wilson are also later on depicted in that fashion as presidents. But Jefferson, right? I hope that you enjoy, even if you don't choose this one. Number three, I hope you read all of them at least. This fictitious account that's paraphrasing Richard Hofstadter's thesis about Thomas Jefferson. Um, Supposedly, right, his mother was a Randolph, and they were high-ranking nobility, and she married down to his commoner father, Peter Jefferson. And the maternal grandparents, his wife's parents, never forgave him for marrying their daughter, and never ceased to remind him that he was not good enough for their daughter. And supposedly Jefferson is depicted as being extremely passive, timid, non-confrontational. But this really ate away at him. Coupled with that is the fact that he felt like he never received the approval, the affirmation that he needed psychologically from his dad. So combine that, right? And Hofstadter surmises that this kid grew up with wealth guilt. That here he is reading Enlightenment works, right? As other people are working with their hands, he doesn't have to because of his mom's blood. He was guaranteed a right on the royal council that was handpicked and didn't even have to run for election. He chose not to, but he could have. He had the best of European tutors, went to France and had an extended college education, et cetera, et cetera. And so he lived like an aristocrat. And in his writings, though, it was the writings of the Enlightenment were largely against privilege of any sort for certain groups of people. And also with his dad, right? So there's this notion, the psychological thesis of Hofstadter's, that Thomas Jefferson went out of his way to try to prove to himself, to prove to the American people, and to prove to his dad, long after his dad passed, that he was not an aristocratic snob and son of his mother's family, but that he was a common, uh, uh, unpretentious, down to earth, democratic guy, right? Man of the people. And so, is there a form of like, compensation, psychological compensation that may have been going on with this young, well-to-do kid, trying to earn his father's affirmation by clinging and siding with the common man against the pretentious wealthy. So when he came in, you see plenty of symbolic stuff like that. He refused to come in on a carriage when he was inaugurated, but by legend, although he took a horse, by legend he walked on foot and wanted no parade. He answered his own door at the White House and allowed this poor widowed woman who lived nearby to commonly come and dine with him, and he would speak with her on such mundane things as like growing their tomato patches, etc. Um, he wouldn't dress up. He wouldn't pay respect to rank when noblemen would come and see him from Europe. And so was some of that almost a bit of passive aggression as his way of kind of sticking it to what he resented about his mom's family. So at any rate, despite that image of being a man of the people, etc., right? Moving on to number 4 is he didn't seem to practice what he preached and what he conveyed, right? So firstly, Hamilton's system, he left it intact, right? And remember, the bank was not officially constitutional. The Liberty bonds and connections with the wealthy, his cabinet taxes, lots of things he did were not technically found in the Constitution. But when it came time for Jefferson to do something about it, his Secretary of the Treasury, um, Gallatin, told him that there are too many loans out to too many key industries, and it had become inextricably linked to our economy. This Hamiltonian system, if you will, and he told his president Jefferson, as much as I too would like to strike Hamilton's system, we can't. It will have a terrible practical domino effect economically on this country. So they contend that Jefferson felt as if he could do nothing about the Hamilton system, and he grudgingly obliged it to continue to exist. So there's contradiction number 1, right? But you know the explanation for it is that he felt like forces larger than himself were compelling him to go against his own beliefs, right? As a president. Then he called for a crusade against ignorance. He wanted a public education system to be expanded throughout all the states. But the 10th Amendment says everything not explicitly given to Congress is reserved to the states, and nothing in Article 1, Section 8 or anywhere else is found about education. So to people in his own Libertarian Party, they said, sorry, Jefferson, you can't mandate that at the national level. Education is a state issue. And so it's up to each state to do its thing. So hence he could do nothing about his vision of having a crusade against ignorance, as he called it, through widespread public education. And not to mention, Jefferson adhered to the Sambo image, despite seeming to be an enlightened man, right? And remember, the works of the Enlightenment had espoused the equality of all human beings, their entitlement to all the same rights and privileges in life, including the pursuit of happiness, right? And self-cultivation. And their environmentalism at that time period, contending, right, that Native Americans, for instance, and certain groups that seem to be primitive and uncivilized are only such because of their circumstances historically, that if you bring them into an enlightened environment, you educate them, etc., that they will become just as civilized as anybody else. But instead, Jefferson, for the pretty much his whole life, from what I've read, adhered to the Sambo image and thinking that Black people from sub-Saharan Africa are innately, inherently, biologically less intelligent, less capable of creating culture, less capable of practicing self-control, etc. That same old Sambo image that was used to justify slavery in the later Jim Crow laws. Also with women, you'll find his quotes to be very patronizing, where he felt like women were, again, biologically, essentially, inherently different and inferior to men, and was not for them to become educated either. And then at the very best, with Native Americans, he took a more environmental thesis and claiming, along with the Enlightenment, that the natives were, quote, primitive and savage only because of circumstances. And so hence only those who are willing to assimilate, to cease to be Native Americans and embrace WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant English American culture, only they would be worthy of attending school. So, you know what I mean? He wasn't that liberal as much as he espoused to be. You got to remember that before he became a big politician, he was writing with the French, writing back and forth with the French correspondent. And he was telling him about what things were like in Virginia and in the colonies. And in those writings, he definitely adhered to a lot of Enlightenment works, and he spoke very well about the rights of all humanity and certain backward practices that he found in Virginia and wanted to end. And so he looked very liberal in these writings. And someone, unbeknownst to him, supposedly publicized these writings. And they're known today as Notes on the State of Virginia. So when you look at that book and those amalgamated letters he wrote into a book, you read, you're like, okay, this guy was pretty liberal and pretty enlightened for his time period. But like I said, was he or was he not? Then, in addition to that, right, the Louisiana Territory. Uh, the Louisiana Territory. Let's see if I have any. Oh shoot, I don't have any pictures on this handout. But the Louisiana Territory, you guys, was huge, absolutely huge. And here he was. Bear with me here. Sorry. Here he was as a. Let me see if I could just look it up here. If the PowerPoint will come up. It's an old PowerPoint. Of course not. That would have been too easy. Try one more time. Let's see here. Look at this Louisiana. Oh, shoot. Your names are covering it up, but it's in brown here. But you see it in the small picture here. Look at that swath of land in brown. He bought the Louisiana Territory. His Mr. Livingston and a couple representatives, that ambassadors that he sent over to Europe. He bought that entire swath of land, right, at a great deal, right, from Napoleon. But where does it say in the Constitution he can do that? Then, after he bought it, he said, hey, you guys got to wait your turn, as in the Northwest Ordinance, before you become petitioned to become enter the country as new states. Until then, he handpicked about 21 men in the north of the section and about 21 men in the south, handpicked dudes to rule over those lands. But this is Mr. Democracy, right? Mr. Voice and common wisdom of the common person will prevail, and the masses of people cannot always be fooled, and the will of the masses sometimes will be wrong, but that it'll be more safe and advantageous for the republic to follow the majority's will than it will be to follow the whims of a few unelected, aristocratic, educated would-be tyrants, right? So here he is, and he's not practicing what he preached. Then, in addition to that, while he is, quote, arguably illegally buying this land as the president, before it was even finalized, he sent Lewis and Clark across the country, right, as well as Zebulon Pike. So he sends them across the country, and part of it, right, officially, it was the topographical engineer crew. So technically, he wanted to know the topography, the land layout, the flora and fauna, animal and plant life, the weather, the rivers and soil. He wanted all kinds of scientific data, as well as specimens brought back to him so he could investigate it and see just what this land was like that he was trying to buy, right? But not to make it into a simple dichotomy, but while Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary, gave a lot of scientific information back to Jefferson that pleased him greatly, Clark, his buddy Clark, arguably, he would oftentimes go to the Native American tribes and say, greeting from your great white father in the White House. And basically tell them, right, we're about to purchase this territory. It's going to become ours. Will you deal with us? Are you willing to allow people to travel through your territory? Are you willing to acknowledge our sovereignty over this territory, right? And if not, he got down their numbers, their military strength, their weaknesses, etc. So my point being is Clark somewhat symbolized a darker, impetus that was driving Jefferson with the Lewis and Clark expedition, whereby that maybe he was desirous of having, that this was almost like a pre-conquest spying expedition of 40 something people coming across and getting vital information that will become, helpful for the U.S. government in the future to control and get what they want over, with, through, or despite these Native American tribes. All right. And so, but with Jefferson, going back to this purchase, he contended that Napoleon is mercurial. He was like bipolar. You never knew what he was going to do. Supposedly his decision to invade Russia, Napoleon's, was a little bit, um, you know, um, impulsive. So he said, we can't afford to have that type of a neighbor next to us. He might try to conquer us next. So notice what he's doing. The ends justify the means, right? That it is a vital, you know, self preservation for this country to buy this territory as quickly as possible from Napoleon. And then also, right, as he was already promising, he'd already tried it as a Virginia diplomat and politician to try to offer Western frontier lands to the poor white men, arguably, at least partially, in exchange for their votes, right? And so he was offering them what they wanted. And not to mention, he thought that the health of a republic was dependent upon the economic status and the character of its common people. And to Jefferson, the common people needed to stay economically independent, not become serfs working on someone else's land, right? Because he thought when you're economically dependent upon someone, you'll become politically dependent upon them as well. But also to stay as virtuous, self sufficient farmers. And so he felt that by extending the territory and pushing good white men, Americans here to become self sufficient farmers, that it would be good for the character and the survival of the American Republic itself. Irina?
Sorry.
No problem. Does anybody have a question? So notice what is a common theme that I'm going over for number 4, you guys, is time after time, our textbook, Alan Brinkley and others contend that are more sympathetic kind of court historians, is they contend that Jefferson felt compelled because of the circumstances to time and time again violate his own beliefs, violate his own rhetoric. All right, because of forces larger than himself. That he was once an idealistic person who wanted to improve the world. But when you become president, they're stating in this particular thesis, right? You can't afford to be idealistic. You have to become pragmatic. That in any given situation, you have to see what the lesser evil is and adhere to it. What will bring about the best practical results for the country rather than what you believe in or don't believe in. So, take that for what it's worth. Perhaps that's being too sympathetic to Jefferson and letting him off the hook. Other people, right, think that power corrupts and that Jefferson became more conservative in age and he became more drunk with power when he became president from 1800 to 1808. So let's see here. Then also, ironically, right, is he engages in an undeclared war against the Barbary Coast pirates from Tunis, right, from Tunisia in North Africa. There was a guy named what's his name? Yusuf Karamanli. Yusuf Karamanli was the Basha, or like the local governor under the Sultan there in the Near East. Okay, and as the Basha there, firstly, he had taken over by force. He literally killed an older brother and sent a younger brother named Hamed to Libya as a local governor and to stay out of his way, and promised that he wouldn't try to covet and take his brother's throne. He advocated, he actually subsidized and helped pay for and promote his system of corsairs. Remember, corsair is like a legalized pirate. To go and basically engage in extortion on the Mediterranean Sea. They would stop merchant ships, demand a certain amount of their commodities or money, and if they didn't offer it in return, they would take people as hostages, and they would offer a ransom for them if they felt the people were of worth or of importance to a certain government. And if they were not, they would simply sell them as slaves in either Istanbul, Turkey, or there in Tunis. And so Jefferson contends that we as a new nation, just beginning our armed forces and standing army, that it is imperative that we not be bullied on the high seas. It was imperative that our merchants not be taken and literally their lives endangered and sold into slavery and have their goods confiscated or their profits eroded by having to pay these extortionary bribes. And so he contended that it was best for the country and even necessary for us to put an end to this system of pirate extortion in the Mediterranean. And remember, when he had written the Declaration of Independence, that was on his list of grievances against Louis or George III of England, was that he sent young boys to their deaths in foreign lands without Parliament's permission. So here he is doing the same thing. He sends famously the USS Philadelphia to go punish the Bey, this Basha of Tunis. And instead, they were tricked and run aground, taken ashore, and the Marines were taken as hostages. They're under this gentleman, under Yusuf. So then now he's got to send an expedition to come save them with a guy named Stephen Decatur. And in addition to that, he sent a man named, oh gosh, shame on me, Eaton, Eaton, to go to Libya, raise a mercenary army with American government funds, raise a mercenary army, and put the brother Hamed on his brother Yusuf's throne, with, of course, Ahmed's promise that he would not engage in this extortion practice. And that didn't work either. Eventually, Congress is going to hear about it, intervene, and they are going to give somewhat of a blank check without a formal declaration of war per se. Give the blank check to the commander in chief to do what he needs to do against the pirates, and in particular, to get the USS Philadelphia sailors back home, even if that meant, which ultimately happened, paying a ransom. And so, at any rate, this was known as the Barbary Coast or Tripolitan War. But for the first initial cases, right, Jefferson tried an attempted coup to overthrow a foreign government, attempted punishment, attempted rescue, without Congress's declaration of war, much less even knowledge of some of the facts. So that's ironic, right? That's the type of things, that type of executive behavior that he complained about George III. And here he is doing it as president. And then, of course, with slaves, right? At any given time, he had about 140 slaves. He inherited them from his dad and from his wife's parents when he married her under English coverture laws that still remained in America. And of course, he made a dichotomy between the slaves, some of whom in his logs he didn't even have a name for. Oftentimes he had no interaction with out on the plantation, right? And those who were his domestics, who worked within his house, ate with the family, received Christmas gifts, even sometimes traveled with him to France. All right. In that group, however, right, he had written, I don't remember if it was in the notes on the state of Virginia, it may have been, but he had written in the past that slavery not only was immoral, not only that eroded the character of both master and slave, right? But in particular, the slave, right? He says it makes a sycophant of the slave, Sycophant. And remember, a sycophant is a political dependent who almost is forced to become dishonest with his or her master. Because after all, you don't have the luxury, right? Because there's such an arbitrary imbalance of power. You cannot, cause any displeasure of your master. So you are to engage in flattery. You are engaged in lying, right? And also, you oftentimes can find yourself engaged in some type of passive or other type of rebellion or aggression toward your master, with whom you could never truly be honest. He says there's no better emblematic example of that than a white master having sexual romantic relationship with a black woman slave. Because after all, does she really have the power to say no? And so to him, that was an example of this, the fakeness and the danger of this relationship, right? And what do you know? He and Sally Hemings had 4 kids that grew to adulthood together. And he continued to have her as kind of almost a common law spouse long after his wife died, giving birth to his second daughter. And so he takes her to Paris, France, and he's able to treat her more as an equal there because they were more progressive with race relations in France at that time. And he promises her before coming back that he will free their children when they become adults, when they hit 18. So at any rate, news of this quote scandal of his relationship with her, and by the way, also the daughter with whom the mother had died giving birth, she had an abusive relationship with her husband. And so she came back to live with her dad, Jefferson, from his white ex dead wife, right? She herself already had a daughter. So now she's in the same house with young Sally Hemings and Sally Hemings' daughter, amongst other kids, with Jefferson. According to multiple sources, this daughter was very abusive towards Sally Hemings, very territorial and jealous, etc. There's no evidence of Thomas Jefferson standing up for Sally Hemings and his biracial kids. When news came of this quote scandal with Sally Hemings, just before he was running for reelection, I believe, um, he told his son Beverly, "Sorry, I know you're 18, but you can't leave because we got to wait for everything to cool down with the news of this scandal." Well, Beverly left anyway, and there's no evidence of them seeing each other again. Madison left as well, in like fashion. He had a young son named Eston, who they said was pretty much a black skinned version of Jefferson himself. And they were very simpatico as far as their common interests and talents and enjoying one another's company. When he was freed, there's not, I can't find any evidence of them reuniting and much less spending time together, much less Jefferson acknowledging publicly his relationship with this biracial son of his. It's just a very sad story. But at any rate, as you might guess, according to this thesis, right, as Jefferson had written down prior to this, he felt like he and his enlightened opposition to slavery was ahead of his generation, and that the Americans could not, um, were not ready to take on slavery and end it. And so hence he felt like the best thing to do, rather than freeing them and and allowing them to be possibly at the mercy of other white parties in the future, that it'd be better for them to stay under his paternal benevolent care and concern. So that's the way he rationalized it, at least keeping these slaves through his death, and and many of them not even freeing upon death, but giving to his white daughter. Not to mention he was constantly in debt as well. So at any rate, does anyone have any questions regarding number four's thesis? Right, that supposedly forces beyond Jefferson's control made him feel compelled, forced, right, to go against his own belief system and make pragmatic, practical decisions, oftentimes which entailed that which he felt was possible for him to deal with, as opposed to impossible forces beyond his control and power. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of just one instance of after another of Jefferson violating his own professed beliefs once he became president? Any comments? You guys are awfully quiet. All right. Well, I hope, can at least someone text something? Can I interpret this silence as you guys are okay as far as your comprehension of all this? Good, good. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Caitlin. All right. Okay, guys, so I'm going to send an announcement by way of this. So don't forget to do your quiz by Sunday night. And I'm going to go ahead and post the War of 1812 video assignment as well. And I'm going to give you till not this Sunday, the 21st, but next Sunday, the 28th, to do both of them on your own time. But please don't procrastinate and wait to do both of them at the last minute, okay? And I apologize for initially doing the wrong assignment. Had forgotten about your spring break. All right, so if there aren't any questions, you guys, I'm going to finally let you go, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You as well. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you,
Thank
Oz.
you.
You're very welcome. Have a good week, okay?